Hi everyone, my name is Jasmine Zeleny and I'm just going to take us through some basic owl identification and ecology. We are really fortunate here in southeast Queensland as we actually have 7 of Australia's 11 owl species. We have 4 species of Tyto owl, which are our barn type owls, and we have 3 species of Ninox owl, which are our hawk owls. So I'm just going to go through each of these 7 species and a few other nocturnal birds that you might hear when you're out and about in the bush here in southeast Queensland. So worldwide we have 2 families of owls, our Titonidae family and our Strigidae family. Our Titonidae family are our barn type owls, so species of barn owl, grass owl, mast owl and the 3 species of bay owl. Here in Australia that's the Tyto genus. So the 2 species of sooty owl, lesser and greater, the Australian mast owl, eastern barn owl and the eastern grass owl. The other family of owls are the Strigidae family, or your typical owl. So this is everything worldwide that doesn't fit into that barn owl category. So if we're thinking of birds that don't fit into this category, this is species like the snowy owl, great grey owl, spectacled owl, your eagle owls, your burrowing owls. I could go on and on. It's a huge family of owls. It's easy for us here in Australia as we only have one genus within this family, and that's the Ninox genus, also known as our hawk owls. So that's species such as the powerful owl, barking owl, rufous owl, Australian boobook and so on. Now our Tyto owls are much more reliant on their hearing when it comes to hunting. That beautiful heart-shaped facial disc acts as a satellite to send the sound waves to their ears, which sit on slightly different levels. This allows them to pinpoint the exact direction and location of their prey. Our hawk owls also have incredible hearing, but they also rely heavily on their eyesight. As you can see, they have those beautiful bright yellow striking eyes. So owls that we might see on surveys for the Powerful Owl Project include the very common Australian boobook. Hopefully everyone will get the chance to see a powerful owl, the eastern barn owl and the much more secretive cousin of the eastern barn owl, the Australian mast owl. So we'll jump straight into our owl ID by starting with the most common owl on Earth, the barn owl, found on every continent except Antarctica. There are several species of barn owl worldwide, but here in Australia we have the eastern barn owl, Tyto javanica. They have that typical Tyto heart-shaped facial disc, and their call is a rough hissing screech, which I will play for you now. The eastern barn owl is widely distributed throughout Australia, occupying a range of habitats such as grasslands, agricultural areas, open and riparian woodland. They're found in our arid zones out in the centre of the country, and they're even found in our city centres. Now, the eastern barn owl has no set breeding season and actually breed in response to food availability. So they're a real boom and bust species. What this means is that when we have favourable conditions such as significant rain events, their prey populations will breed up in response to this, and in turn, species like the eastern barn owl take advantage of this rise in numbers in their prey populations, and this is when they will breed. This means that the eastern barn owl can breed at any time of the year, and they can actually breed more than once in a year. Now, this can make it hard for us to monitor breeding pairs of eastern barn owls, as we never know when chicks are going to pop their head out of the hollow, unlike our large forest owls, which are typically seasonal breeders breeding in the winter months. As you can see in this photo on the right, the eastern barn owl normally nest in tree hollows, but there are some records of birds nesting in caves and old abandoned buildings. The eastern barn owl feed mainly on small mammals, and rodents do make up the bulk of their diet, so as you can imagine, species like the eastern barn owl are hit heavily by secondary poisoning from rodenticides. But like all owls, their diet is highly variable and may include other animals such as insects, frogs and lizards. So our second Tyto is the very secretive cousin of the eastern barn owl, the Australian mast owl. The Australian mast owl comes in 3 basic plumage forms, pale, intermediate and dark as pictured. So the middle and right hand birds are actually the Tasmanian subspecies, race Castanops, which are listed as endangered. The other subspecies which is listed as a threatened species is the northern mast owl, race Kimberley. So here in southeast Queensland we do get all 3 plumage forms. but the intermediate and dark forms are few and far between. Most birds that you see will look like this bird on the far left, very pale and often with a slight buff tinted collar, but not always. Sometimes you can get birds which are completely pale white and just look like a much stockier version of the eastern barn owl. So I'll just play the call of the Australian marst owl for you now. So quite similar to the call of the eastern barn owl, they have that typical tighto rasping screech, but the difference is that it's a much deeper drawn out rasping screech compared to the higher pitched, faster paced screech of the eastern barn owl. So the Australian marst owl occupies this tall old growth eucalypt forest. You can find them hunting over rainforest as well. If you were to go out and target this species, it would be best for you to head to the mountain ranges and the areas surrounding the bottom of those ranges. So here in Brisbane, places like the Diagula Range and the suburbs surrounding the foothills of those ranges. So in the western suburbs of Brisbane, places like Brookfield and Pullenvale. If you're going around the other side of the Diagula Range, places like Highvale, Samford, Samsonvale, for example. And if you were to try and find a nest tree, you would be heading towards creek lines and looking for grand old trees where either the main trunk or a major branch has completely snapped off to form a chimney-type hollow that they can drop into. So out of all of our Australian marst owl nest trees in southeast Queensland, all of them bar one has been in a tree with these chimney-type hollows. Now they feed mainly on small mammals, but they can tackle some larger prey items. As you can see, they are a heavy and stocky bird, so they can take larger mammals like bandicoots and the odd possum as well. So like I said, most birds here in southeast Queensland are going to be pale form birds. So this can make it quite hard for you to distinguish between eastern barn owls and Australian marst owls. So there are a few features that we look for. So immediately you'll notice that the Australian marst owl has a more rounded facial disc, whereas the eastern barn owl has a more heart-shaped facial disc. It is a subtle difference, but if you go through all of the photos, you will see it. The Australian marst owl can have a more complete dark edging to the facial disc, but not always, so don't rely on this too heavily. Also, if you were to come across one of these tighto owls roosting during the day, they will often have their facial disc folded in and they'll be looking quite alien-like. So obviously, the shape of the facial disc is quite manipulated while they're roosting during the day, so it can be really hard to tell the shape. So some more reliable features that we look for are the legs and feet. So the Australian marst owl have very thick, powerful, fully feathered legs. So the entire leg is feathered right down to the foot. If you look at the eastern barn owl, their legs are very dainty and delicate and only partially feathered. The Australian marst owl also has huge feet compared to the eastern barn owl. And the last feature that we look for is the barring on the primary and secondary feathers on the wings. So if you look at the Australian marst owl in this picture, you can see that the barring is very obvious on the primary and secondaries. If you look at the eastern barn owl, they do have very faint bars, but there are fewer bars and they're not as defined. You'll notice that on the Australian marst owl, there are always 4 very clear bars on the secondary feathers. So our third tighto owl and my personal favourite is the sooty owl. Now the sooty owl is a rainforest species, but you can find them hunting around and roosting within dry forest as well. So just over the past few months, we have had a few records of sooty owls roosting within the creek lines of Mount Cootha. Now Mount Cootha does have great connectivity to the rest of the Diagula Range, but I do still think it's quite amazing to have sooty owls so close to the CBD. But if you were to go out and target this species or try and find a nest tree, you will have to head to the rainforest. So if you're in Brisbane, places like Mount Nebo and Mount Glorious. If you're on the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast, head to the hinterland and get into that rainforest habitat. Now the sooty owl does have a range of vocalisations, but they're most well known for their bomb drop call. I'll play this call for you now. So quite an amazing and spine-chilling vocalisation. The sooty owl will make this bomb drop call as they leave and return to their roost, and you'll also hear them making this call as they're flying around their territory at night. But like I said, they do have a few different vocalisations. They will make some typical tighto rasping screeches, and they also make a series of very sweet insect-like trills. Now, the sooty owl is quite a large and heavy bird. I think people underestimate just how big they can get. Female birds can reach over 50 centimetres in height and over a kilo in weight. So to put things in perspective, this is getting within the weight range of a female powerful owl. So they're very powerfully built with strong thick legs and very large feet. So this enables them to tackle larger prey items such as greater gliders, ringtail possums, flying foxes, bandicoots, sugar gliders, but they do have a highly variable diet and they'll take smaller prey items as well, things like insects, melomys and antechinus. In terms of nest tree preferences, here in southeast Queensland, all of our sooty owl nest trees have been in Eucalyptus grandis, which you may know as the flooded gum or rose gum. So our fourth and final Tyto owl is the eastern grass owl. I can't imagine many people will be running into this species while doing surveys for the project, as they're found in habitat which is pretty much completely unsuitable for powerful owls. So they're found in open wetland habitats and grasslands. You can also find them in areas with a lot of sugarcane crop. Now, if you were to go out and target this species, you'd head to areas like Kedron Brook near Brisbane Airport or Lake Sampsonvale, for example. Now, the eastern grass owl is actually a very quiet Tyto owl. They'll sometimes make those typical Tyto-like screeches, but generally speaking, they'll just make a very quiet cricket-like trill. I'll play that cricket-like trill for you now. So the eastern grass owl is quite unique in that it's our only Australian owl that doesn't require old growth trees with hollows for nesting, because they actually nest on the ground. So what this species will do is they'll flatten a large area of grass and make a depression, and that's where they'll put their eggs. They'll then make a network of tunnels which leads to this flattened area where their young are, and they'll use those tunnels to come and go to their young and bring them food. Now, their diet is made up mainly of small mammals, and if you think about the areas they're occupying, the bulk of this will be rodents. Unfortunately, that means the eastern grass owl is yet another species which is hit hard by secondary poisoning from rodenticides, but they will take other prey items such as birds and insects. Now, if you think about the habitats that eastern grass owls occupy, you're obviously going to run into eastern barn owls as well. So how do we separate the two species? If you look at these photos below, you'll see that the eastern grass owl have very long and dangly legs, which is where that Latin name longa membris comes from. You'll often see eastern grass owls on the wing. It's very rare to see them perched. So we need to look at these long trailing legs in flight to separate them from eastern barn owls. So you'll see that a portion of the leg and the entire foot sticks out beyond the tail. If you were to look at an eastern barn owl in flight, maybe only a little bit of the talon would stick out beyond the tail. If we're looking at this eastern grass owl on the right, you'll notice that the crown, the back and the wings are much darker than what you would see in an eastern barn owl, and their face also appears much longer than the eastern barn owls, as the eyes are smaller and set further apart in the eastern grass owl. So we'll jump straight into our Ninox owls by starting with our smallest and most common owl in Australia, the Australian boobook. Now, you might know this species as the southern boobook, but the southern boobook has recently been split into several species, and the species found in Australia is now recognised as its own, the Australian boobook. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the distinctive call of the boobook, which I'll play for you now. So besides this typical boobook call, they have a few other vocalizations that you might hear. They have a faster paced call known as the paw 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 call, and around breeding time, especially around the nest, you may hear a special call called the bray call, and this sounds a little bit like a meowing sound. It's a really interesting vocalization if you ever get the chance to hear it. Now, the Australian boobook is quite similar to the barking owl at a glance. The species are often confused with each other. The Australian boobook is a smaller bird, but this can be really hard to judge, as unfortunately you're not going to have an Australian boobook and a barking owl sitting side by side to give you an idea of scale, so we have to rely on a few other features. The Australian boobook has much more heavily spotted underparts compared to the streaky underparts of the barking owl. The barking owl also has bright yellow eyes, whereas the Australian boobook has very dull yellow to green eyes. If you look at the feet of the barking owl, they're larger and they're bright orange in colour. The feet of the Australian boobook are grey to brown in colour. Now, the Australian boobook can have a more obvious white brow, but not always, and they can sometimes have more obvious goggles, but this depends on a number of factors. There is variation between individuals, there's variations between subspecies, and there's variation depending on the age of the bird. Younger birds will have much more obvious goggles compared to older birds. So the Australian boobook is found in a variety of habitats, which is why they are so widespread across the country. You can find the Australian boobook in tall, open, dry sclerophyll forest. You can find them in dense rainforest. You can find them out in the centre of the country in our arid zones and deserts, and you can even find them in your own backyard. There are a few different subspecies of the Australian boobook. Here in southeast Queensland, we have the nominate subspecies Ninox boobook. If you head up to North Queensland, you can find a very small rainforest-specific subspecies known as the little red boobook, Ninox boobook. And if you head out into our arid zones in Western Queensland, you'll find Ninox boobook ocellata. Now, the Australian boobook does have a variable diet. They'll feed on a lot of insects. They'll also take small mammals and small birds. Unfortunately, the Australian boobook is another species which is hit hard by secondary poisoning from rodenticides. Now, the Australian boobook is yet another species that requires old-growth trees with hollows for nesting, but they will also use these tree hollows for roosting. So our next Ninox owl is the barking owl. Unfortunately, the barking owl is a very uncommon bird in southeast Queensland, and this is pretty much the case throughout the entire southern part of their range. But once you head further north to places like North Queensland and the Northern Territory, the barking owl is actually a very common bird. Here in southeast Queensland, we only have a few known pairs, and there have been quite a few records of random nomads passing through certain areas, but they haven't stuck around for long, unfortunately. So they're found in open woodlands and forest edges, often close to a cleared area. You can find them in creek lines. If there are melaleucas available, I've often found them roosting in melaleucas. Now, their call sounds like the woof of a dog, which is obviously where they get their name. I'll play that call for you now. So that recording is an example of a bit of a woofing frenzy between a male and female bird. The female bird has the higher pitched call compared to the lower pitched call of the male. We actually had a female bird pass through a conservation area in Upper Caboolture a few years ago. She hung around for a few months, but she would woof for about an hour on dusk, and because she had that really yappy female call, she was quite close to an urban boundary and she would set off all of the neighbourhood dogs. So I'm sure she wasn't a very popular visitor at the time. Now, the barking owl has a very highly variable diet. So they'll take things like insects and reptiles, but they'll also take other birds. We've actually seen barking owls with tawny frogmouths in their talons, which is pretty cool. They'll also take mammals like bush rats and black rats. They'll take squirrel gliders. We've got a photo of one with a squirrel glider, which is a pretty impressive prey item for their size. But whatever they can manage, they'll take. Now, like I said in previous slides, the barking owl is often confused with a very similar Australian boobook. We'll just go through those features again. If we look at this photo on the right hand side, you can see that the barking owl has those bright yellow eyes. They also have those bright orange large feet and streaky underparts. And the goggles around their eyes are nowhere near as obvious as what you'd expect in some Australian boobooks. So our third and final Ninox owl is the star of the show, the powerful owl. The powerful owl is Australia's largest owl, with males reaching a whopping 65 centimetres in height and close to 2 kilos in weight. Now, they have a relatively small head which is quite distinct from their body and a long, rounded, paddle-shaped tail. Like some other Ninox owls, they have those bright yellow eyes and bright yellow feet. You'll notice that they also have these very distinctive chevrons, or you might want to call them little love hearts, on their underparts. No other Australian owl has these love hearts on their underparts, so that's a really good feature to look out for. Now, the powerful owl is found across eastern and southeastern Australia, mainly on the eastern side of the Great Dividing Range. They occur from around central Queensland in the Mackay region all the way down to Victoria. Now, when we think about these magnificent large owls, we think that they're occurring in these tall, old-growth forests, and while they do occur there, they're starting to turn up right into our cities. So they're turning up in some very small green spaces and in some interesting habitat, which I'm sure we will cover in some other videos. But where available, they do like to stick to creeklines and gullies. These creeklines provide more dense vegetation, which gives them more cover while roosting, more protection during the day. And it's also a few degrees cooler in these creeklines and gullies. So the powerful owl is yet another species of owl that requires old-growth trees with very large hollows for nesting. We're talking about trees that are hundreds of years old. The male will prepare the nest and provide for the female and the young, and once the chicks fledge, then both sexes will provide for the very demanding chicks. The powerful owl feed mainly on arboreal prey, with common ringtail possums being a favoured prey item, but they will take things like small and large glider species, so sugar gliders, squirrel gliders and greater gliders. They'll take flying foxes, and they'll also eat other bird species. We've seen powerful owls taking rainbow lorikeets, sulphur-crested cockatoos and even tawny frogmouths. Now, the powerful owl won't just take large prey items, they'll also take smaller prey items like insects. So if you open up their pellets around Christmas time, you might find that they've decorated them with some very festive and beautiful Christmas beetles. Down in Sydney, they've found that their urban birds are starting to take more terrestrial prey, which is quite interesting, as previously we wouldn't thought that that would be on the menu for powerful owls. But they're taking advantage of a local and abundant prey source, so things like black rats, rabbits and even the odd cat. So this means that threats like secondary poisoning from rodenticides, which we previously wouldn't have thought would be a threat to powerful owls, will be an emerging issue that we have to keep an eye on. Now, the powerful owl is vulnerable under Queensland legislation, and they're actually listed as a threatened species in every state that they occur in. But funnily enough, they're not actually listed nationally, which is something that we're working on. So I'm just going to go through some powerful owl vocalizations. We'll start with the female typical double note woohoo call. Next is the male call. And this third vocalization is the trills of chicks. All Ninox owl chicks trill. I find powerful owl chicks actually have the sweetest trill. If you listen to the trills of barking owl and Australian boobook chicks, it's a much harsher trill. So I'll play that powerful owl chick trill now. And this last vocalization is a bleating call. I'll play it for you and then I'll explain the different instances in which a powerful owl might use this vocalization. So it's a pretty scary noise. It sounds like a demonic sheep. Now there's a few reasons why the powerful owl might use this bleating call. So I've heard them use this bleating call to communicate with each other and to communicate with their chicks. I've also heard them make this bleating call for an entire hour leading up to a mating event. And I've also heard them make this bleating call while they were roosting during the day and a Teresian crow was jumping around them and harassing them. Now, in terms of distinguishing between male and female powerful owl calls, while the male call is usually lower, males can call high and females can call low, just to make things difficult for you. But there is one thing that we can listen out for to help us distinguish between the two sexes. So when the males call, the second note of the call will either drop or stay the same pitch, and in females, the second note goes up. So like I said, females can call low and males can call high, so we need to pay attention to the second note of the call. I'll play an example of a low calling female now. So notice how the second note always went up even though it was a low call. I'll now play an example of a high calling male, and again pay attention to the pitch of the second note of the call. So these two clips are a really good example of why it's not as simple as males call low and females call high. It's really important to listen to the pitch of the second note of the call. So in terms of aging powerful owls and looking at their change in plumage, powerful owls fledge at 8 weeks of age. You can see when they fledge, their underparts and head are covered in this fluffy white down feather. This bird on the far left is 2 days out of the hollow, and you can see it is totally unimpressed with the world already. The second bird is 4 months old, and you can see those chevrons starting to come through on the underparts, and the mast on the face is starting to become darker and larger. And by 6 months of age, they've pretty much got their adult plumage. We can still tell this is a young bird as its head is still quite pale. But a few weeks after this bird already looked exactly like an adult. So the giveaway is that birds will still trill, young birds will still trill well into the next year. So while they may look like an adult bird, if you keep an eye on them after dark and listen to their vocalizations, you'll still be able to distinguish if it's one of last year's young. Now, in terms of sexing powerful owls, we've always known that males are the larger of the two sexes. They're a bigger bird with a broader chest, a larger, squarer head, and a flatter crown. But unfortunately, this still isn't super easy to distinguish between the two sexes. You're not always going to have a male and female bird sitting side by side presenting themselves nicely on a branch for you. And depending on what angle you're looking at them from, or whether or not they're puffing up and manipulating the shape of their head, it's not always going to be easy to look for these features. Thankfully, the team down at Deakin University in Victoria recently released a paper in February this year which explains how to sex powerful owls by looking at photographs. Now, if we look at this bottom image, which is taken from this paper, you can see the bird on the left, which is a female bird, has a much narrower and rounded head. And this means that the face mask extends all the way to the horizontal edge of the head. Whereas this bird on the right-hand side, the male bird, which has a much wider head, you can see that the face mask actually stops before the horizontal edge of the head. When I read this, I couldn't believe how much easier it made things. I actually went back through all of my photos where I knew the sexes of the powerful owls and tested it out, and it proved to be 100% accurate for every image that I looked at. So it's pretty amazing that this has gone unnoticed for so long and makes things so much easier. So now I'm just going to go through some other bird calls that you might hear while you're out and about doing surveys at night. We'll start with the very common tawny frogmouth. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the sound of a tawny frogmouth. Next is the Australian owlet nightjar, a very common bird. You'll often hear them. You'll hear them more than you see them. They actually don't give off much of an eye shine at all, so you have to be really close to the bird to actually spot them. They have a range of vocalizations, but this is just one of them. And of course, the bushstone curlew. I think you'd have to be living under a rock to not be familiar with their call. So this next bird has one of the coolest bird calls. It's the white-throated nightjar, a very common bird in southeast Queensland, and you're most likely to hear them calling on dusk. I'll play their call for you now. So that's one seriously cool bird call. The other nightjar that we have in southeast Queensland is the large-tailed nightjar. Now these are more of a northern bird, so unfortunately you don't get them on the Gold Coast or in Brisbane, but you can get them in a few areas of the Sunshine Coast, so places like Coolum and Bli and up in Cooloola. I'll play their call for you now. It's quite different to the white-throated nightjar call. And the last bird that you may be lucky to run into if you're in rainforest habitat is the marbled frogmouth, the much more secretive cousin of the tawny frogmouth. Now they have completely different habits to tawny frogmouths. They're a rainforest specialist, they're very secretive. You're not going to see one out in the open presenting itself on a guidepost on the side of the road, unfortunately. Now they have a range of vocalizations, and there is quite a difference between the female and male vocalizations in this species. Now I'm going to play two different calls, and I'll play the male and female call of each of these. So the first is the gobble bill clap call, and the other call is the kooloo call. So I'll play those for you now. So another seriously cool bird call. I think the white-throated nightjar and marbled frogmouths have some of my favourite calls of all Australian birds. The spotted nightjar found out west is also pretty cool, quite similar to the white-throated nightjar if you want to look it up. Unfortunately, not quite found in southeast Queensland. You just have to head out of this region to get the spotted nightjar. Now, if you wanted to learn a bit more about how to separate the very common tawny frogmouth and the marbled frogmouth, you can head on over to our Facebook page, Brisbane Powerful Owls, and I've done a few very comprehensive ID quizzes there, and I go through the differences between tawny and marbled frogmouths quite thoroughly if you want to have a look at that. So now that we've gone through our 7 species of owl in southeast Queensland, I thought it would be a good idea to do a quick little owl ID quiz to test your knowledge. Now the first owl ID quiz is going to be between two Ninox owls which are commonly confused, the Australian boobook and the barking owl. Now as I go through each image, I'm going to give you about 10 to 15 seconds to have a crack at the ID yourself before I give you the answer. So this is the first image to ID. So this bird is a barking owl. You can see those bright yellow eyes, those very streaky underparts, and sticking out from the other side of the branch you can see those bright orange feet. Second bird. So this bird is also a barking owl. So this is an Australian boobook owl. Note the spottier underparts, the dull yellow eyes. You can just see the little browny grey feet sticking out from over the branch, and note the more obvious white brow and goggles around the eyes. This is another barking owl. This photo gives us a really good look at those bright orange feet. This bird is an Australian boobook. This is another Australian boobook. This image gives us a really good look at those little grey feet. This is a barking owl. And this is another Australian boobook. So this slide just shows the ID features used to separate the two species. So on the left here, a comparison between the spotty underparts of the Australian boobook compared to the streakier underparts of the barking owl. The middle image shows the comparison between the eye colour of the two species, with the barking owl having much brighter yellow eyes, and the Australian boobook eye colour is very dull in comparison. And on the right hand side, we have a comparison between the foot colour of the two species, with the Australian boobook having these small grey feet and the barking owl having larger bright orange feet. The Australian boobook can also have a more obvious white brow and more obvious goggles, but there is variation between how obvious these goggles are depending on the age of the bird. Younger birds typically have very obvious goggles. Just differences between individuals as well, and differences between certain subspecies of the Australian boobook as well. So our second owl ID quiz is going to be between two Tyto owls that are commonly confused, the eastern barn owl and the Australian masked owl. Again, I'll give you 10 to 15 seconds to have a crack at the ID yourself before I give you the answer. This first bird is obviously an intermediate form Australian masked owl, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to make this quiz a little bit more difficult but realistic by making the rest of the masked owls in this quiz pale morph birds. If I were to give you a quiz full of intermediate and dark morph masked owls, that would make it too easy, as we don't have that variation in plumage in eastern barn owls. This is an Australian masked owl. Note that more rounded facial disc with a dark edging. You can see those nice bars on the primary feathers. So this is an eastern barn owl. We can see that nice heart-shaped facial disc. The wings in the back are quite light in colour, and all those brown tones blend seamlessly into one another. If we look at the barring on the primary and secondary feathers, there are fewer number of bars, and they're nowhere near as defined as what you would expect on the wings of an Australian masked owl. If we look at the legs, they're quite dainty and delicate and only partially feathered, and the feet are also quite small. So this is a newly fledged Australian masked owl chick. Notice the very dark edging to the facial disc, the much darker back and wings, those huge feet, and if you look under that tutu of down feather, you can see that the legs are fully feathered. This is an eastern barn owl. This is an Australian masked owl. This is a very pale bird, and this photo has tricked a lot of people. This is a bird from the Sunshine Coast, but you can see more rounded facial disc with a nice dark edging, those huge feet, and if you look at the legs, they're much thicker and fully feathered. This is another eastern barn owl. So this image shows two Australian marstale fledglings. You can see that nice, really dark edging to the facial disc and their large feet poking out from the other side of the branch. And they have a much darker back and wings. This is another young Australian marstale. Notice that dark edging to the facial disc, which is more rounded. And if you look at the back of the bird, which is very dark, you can see that nice barring on the primary feathers. And from the back, you can see those nice fully feathered legs. So this last slide just covers the main features used to separate the two species. If we look at the image on the left here, it shows a really nice comparison between the eastern barn owl and Australian marst owl. So the eastern barn owl on the top has that very heart-shaped facial disc. You can see those dainty, partially feathered legs and smaller feet. And if we look at the wings and the back, a lot of nice browny tones which blend seamlessly into each other. And if we look at the bars on the primary and secondary feathers, they're quite faint and there are fewer bars. If we look at the bird on the bottom, the Australian marst owl, you can see that more rounded facial disc. The back and wings are a lot darker with that very obvious barring on the primary and secondary feathers. And if we look at the legs, they're much thicker and stronger, and they're fully feathered all the way down to the foot, and the feet are much larger. On the top right hand side, just showing the variation in plumage forms in Australian marst owls. You will not see this variation in plumage in eastern barn owls. At most, you'll see variation in the spotting on the underparts and maybe a slight buff tinted collar on some birds, but you will never see these intermediate and dark form plumage in eastern barn owls. This bottom photo just shows the thick, fully feathered legs of an Australian marst owl in my hand, just to give you an idea of just how powerful these birds are and how big their feet are. Really impressive talons on these birds. So that's all for my talk on owl identification and ecology. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope you learnt something new.